I think all of us have known twins at times, and usually when you think of twins, you think of identical twins, right? You think of twins that look alike, either two boys that look alike or two girls that look alike. That's why we call them identical twins, because they are identical. They look alike, but actually there are more fraternal twins than there are identical twins. You see, they're not only identical twins, and that's two boys or two girls that look alike, but they're also what we would call fraternal twins. And those are twins that are in the same womb, carried at the same time, born right after one another, and yet they don't look alike. You see, an identical twin, you have the same sperm and you have the same egg, but fraternal twins, you have two different sperm and you have two different eggs, but they're carried in the womb at the same time. It can be two boys, it can be two girls, it can be a boy and a girl, fraternal twins. I think all of us have met twins, known of twins, and usually when we think of those identical twins, we think of two that think alike, look alike, maybe can finish one another's sentences. They get along. We almost think that they can sense what's going on in the other person's life. Well, today in the Bible, we're going to look at a set of twins, and I don't believe they were identical twins. I think they were what we would call fraternal twins. They were carried in the womb at the same time. They were carried in the womb by their mother, and yet they were very different. They looked different. They acted different. They did not get along. We know even in the womb they were fighting with one another. The Bible talks about them jostling with one another in the womb. Of course, I'm talking about Jacob and Esau. And so I want to look at this story today. There are many passages that we could go to, and we're going to look at a few passages today. But I want to turn your attention to Genesis chapter 27. Genesis chapter 27, and I want to read most of this chapter, and it is a pretty lengthy chapter, but I think it's important that we read the whole story. This is one of the most intriguing stories, not only in all of the Old Testament, but in all of the Bible. It has suspense, it has drama, it has intrigue, and if this story was made into a movie, you would be on the edge of your seat wondering if Jacob's plan, if Rebekah's plan would be accomplished, or if maybe Isaac would figure out what's going on. It's a very interesting story. And the theme, the thematic word in this story is the idea of bless or blessing. And as I read this story today, and I've asked them to boldface it in the text, as I read this story today, I want you to think about how many times you hear the verb bless or the noun blessing. Actually, we see it in this passage 23 times in this one chapter. And when you hear the word bless, when you hear the word blessing, you might think, well, what is it talking about? Because these patriarchs, they would gather their children, and one of the sons would be blessed by God, and by blessing that son, what that patriarch was saying is, I am speaking over your life the favor of God. I'm speaking over your life the protection of God. I'm speaking over your life the prosperity of God. But it's not only that, it was delineating the lineage of the Messiah and saying, through your seed, through your descendants, eventually will come one who is known as the Messiah, the anointed one who will save his people from their sins. So think about this word blessing as we read through the passage today. Let's begin in verse 1 of Genesis chapter 27. It says, when Isaac was old and his eyes were dim so that he could not see, by the way, they didn't have glasses in those days, he called Esau, his older son, and said to him, my son. And he answered, here I am. He said, behold, I am old. I do not know the day of my death. Now then, take your weapons, your quiver and your bow, and go out to the field and hunt game for me, and prepare for me delicious food such as I love, and bring it to me so that I may eat, that my soul may bless you before I die. By the way, you see in this passage, Isaac really liked to eat. I think if he was living today, his favorite show would be Diners, Drive-Ins, and Dives. It says in verse 5, now Rebekah, that's Isaac's wife, now Rebekah was listening when Isaac spoke to his son Esau. So when Esau went to the field to hunt for game and bring it, Rebekah said to her son Jacob, I heard your father speak to your brother Esau, bring me game and prepare for me delicious food that I may eat it and bless you before the Lord before I die. Now therefore, my son, obey my voice as I command you. Go to the flock and bring me 2 good young goats so that I may prepare from them delicious food for your father, such as he loves. And you shall bring it to your father to eat so that he may bless you before he dies. But Jacob said to Rebekah, his mother, behold, my brother Esau is a hairy man. That's actually what the word Esau means. It means hairy, because when he came out of the womb, he was hairy. He said, behold, my brother Esau is a hairy man, and I am a smooth man. And by the way, there's a double connotation here. Not only did he have smooth skin, he was a smooth operator. He was a deceitful man. And actually the word Jacob means deceiver or cheater, because he was hanging on to the heel of his brother. When Esau came out of the womb, Jacob had a hold of his heel. And that's why he became known as Jacob, or deceiver or cheater. He said, I'm a smooth man. Yes, I have smooth skin, but I'm smooth in other ways as well. Perhaps my father will feel me, and I shall seem to be mocking him and bring a curse upon myself and not a blessing. His mother said to him, let your curse be on me, my son. Only obey my voice and go bring them to me. Seems like Rebekah was kind of deceitful as well here. So he went and took them and brought them to his mother, and his mother prepared delicious food such as his father loved. Then Rebekah took the best garments of Esau, her older son, which were with her in the house, and put them on Jacob, her younger son. And the skins of the young goats she put on his hands and on the smooth part of his neck. And she put the delicious food and the bread which she had prepared into the hand of her son Jacob. So has the food, the clothing of Esau, the goat skins to cover his smooth skin and his neck so that he appears hairy. And it would suggest that this is Esau and not Jacob. So again, look with me, verse 18. So he went into his father and said, my father. And he said, here I am. Who are you, my son? Already Isaac is kind of figuring out or wondering, is this really Esau? Jacob said to his father, I am Esau, your firstborn. I have done as you told me. Now sit up and eat of my game, that your soul may bless me. But Isaac said to his son, how is it that you have found it so quickly, my son? He answered, because the Lord your God granted me success. Isn't this interesting? You see through this passage that Jacob is telling bold-faced lies. I mean, he's just flat out saying, I am Esau. And then after that, he even brings the Lord into the equation and says, it's the Lord is the one who has blessed me. Look with me again at verse 18. Let me just read that verse again. It says, so he went into his father and said, my father. And he said, here I am. Who are you, my son? And Jacob said to his father, I am Esau, your firstborn. Bold-faced lie. I am Esau, your firstborn son. I have done as you told me. Now sit up and eat of my game, that your soul may bless me. But Isaac said to his son, how is it that you have found it so quickly, my son? And now he actually brings God into his lies. You know, it's one thing to tell a lie. It's another thing to bring God into your lies. And this is what he said. Because the Lord your God granted me success. Then Isaac said to Jacob, please come near that I may feel you, my son, to know whether you are really my son Esau or not. Again, he's detecting something's not right here. So Jacob went near to Isaac his father, who felt him and said, the voice is Jacob's voice, but the hands are the hands of Esau. And he did not recognize him because his hands were hairy like his brother Esau's hands. So he blessed him, which has the idea, so he proceeded to bless him. He's about to bless him. Verse 24, he said, are you really my son Esau? Again, he tells a bold-faced lie. He answered, I am. Then he said, bring it near to me that I may eat of my son's game and bless you. So he brought it near to him, and he ate, and he brought him wine, and he drank. Then his father Isaac said to him, come near and kiss me, my son. So he came near and kissed him, and Isaac smelled the smell of his garments and blessed him and said, see, the smell of my son is as the smell of a field that the Lord has blessed. May God give you of the dew of heaven and of the fatness of the earth and plenty of grain and wine. Let peoples serve you and nations bow down to you. Be Lord over your brothers, and may your mother's sons bow down to you. Cursed be everyone who curses you, and blessed be everyone who blesses you. So Isaac has given the blessing to Jacob. Again, if you were watching this movie, you realize that Esau has already returned. He's over in another area putting together the delicious food for his father Isaac. And just as Jacob leaves, Esau comes in. The drama, the suspense, the intrigue. Verse 30, as soon as Isaac had finished blessing Jacob, when Jacob had scarcely gone out from the presence of Isaac his father, Esau, his brother, came in from his hunting. Of course, he knew nothing of this that was happening while he was hunting and preparing the meal. He also prepared delicious food and brought it to his father. And he said to his father, let my father arise and eat of his son's game, that you may bless me. His father Isaac said to him, who are you? He answered, I am your son, your firstborn Esau. Then Isaac trembled very violently and said, who was it then that hunted game and brought it to me, and I ate it all before you came, and I have blessed him, yes, and he shall be blessed. As soon as Esau heard the words of his father, he cried out with an exceedingly great and bitter cry, and said to his father, bless me, even me also, O my father. But he said, your brother came deceitfully, and he has taken away your blessing. Esau said, is he not rightly named Jacob? For he has cheated me these 2 times. Actually, in the Hebrew, it says, is he not rightly named Jacob? For he has Jacobed me these 2 times, because the word Jacob means to cheat. He took away my birthright, and behold, now he has taken away my blessing. Then he said, have you not reserved a blessing for me? Isaac answered and said to Esau, behold, I have made him lord over you, and all of his brothers I have given to him for servants, and with grain and wine I have sustained him. What then can I do for you, my son? Esau said to his father, have you but one blessing, my father? Bless me, even me also, my father. And Esau lifted up his voice and wept. Then Isaac his father answered and said to him, and this is more of an anti-blessing than it is a blessing, behold, away from the fatness of the earth shall your dwelling be, and away from the dew of heaven on high. By your sword you shall live, and you shall serve your brother. But when you grow restless, you shall break his yoke from your neck. Now Esau hated Jacob because of the blessing with which his father had blessed him. And Esau said to himself, the days of mourning for my father are approaching. Then I will kill my brother Jacob. Now, have you ever met a more dysfunctional family than this family? Hey, the Bible's pretty interesting. You know, some people say, oh, I don't ever read the Bible, it's boring. That's not boring. Again, you could turn that into a movie. This, my friend, is a dysfunctional family. There is favoritism, there is deceit, lying, jealousy, cheating. All of that is in this family. Maybe you come from a dysfunctional family. Maybe you come from a family that's not perfect, and there is strife and conflict and maybe favoritism and lying and deceitfulness right here in the Bible. Among the patriarchs of God, you have this type of dysfunctional family. Let me tell you, this is not Leave It to Beaver. This is more like All in the Family. Jacob and Esau. And, you know, kind of the big point that I want you to glean from this passage today and glean from this message today is this. And I'm going to share this throughout the message, but I hope that you'll leave today with this ringing in your ears. God's grace is amazing. God's people are not. When you think about the grace of God, when you think about the unconditional love of God, and you see the grace of God in this passage, even with the deceit, even with the cheating, God still blessed Jacob, and through the lineage of Jacob came the Messiah. God's grace is amazing. God's people are not. Let me tell you, God's people can be broken. God's people can be flawed. God's people can be dysfunctional. God's grace is amazing. God's people are not. And Isaac was a patriarch. Jacob was a patriarch. Rebekah was a matriarch. This was God's people. And yet you have the dysfunctionality, you have the cheating, the lying, the favoritism, the jealousy among God's people. God's grace is amazing. God's people are not. Now, when you think about this story and when you think about how Jacob deceived his father Isaac in order to gain the blessing, when you think about the strife, when you think about the dysfunctionality in this family and in this story in particular, you might ask, who's to blame? Who's at fault? You had four characters. You have Isaac, you have Rebekah, you have Jacob, and you have Esau. And, you know, I think it's important to ask, who's to blame? Whose fault is this? Because if you read this story and you don't read it carefully and you don't read it biblically, you could get the idea that Isaac is the innocent victim. You could maybe even feel sorry for Esau because his brother stole his blessing from him. And yet I believe if you read this story carefully and biblically, what you'll find out is there's enough blame to go around. Every single one of them was guilty of wrongdoing. And I want to walk you through this to show you the wrongdoing of each of these characters. First of all, let's talk about the wrongdoing of Isaac. Again, it's easy to see him as innocent and passive, and he's been taken advantage of. But I think if you read this story in its context in the book of Genesis, what you'll realize is Isaac seems like the innocent victim, but he put his will before God's. Now you might say, well, how did Isaac put his will before God's will? Because of the prophecy. There was a prophecy given when Rebekah was pregnant with the twins. There was a prophecy given that the older would serve the younger. I want to remind you of that prophecy. Go back to Genesis chapter 25, verses 21 through 23. Isaac was 40 when he got married, and they waited for 20 years. And Rebekah, she did not get pregnant until Isaac was 60, and so he prayed, and her womb was open, and the Lord blessed her with children. But it says in verse 21, and Isaac prayed to the Lord for his wife because she was barren. And the Lord granted his prayer, and Rebekah, his wife, conceived. The children struggled together within her. They were already fighting, and they weren't even out of the womb yet. And she said, if it is thus, why is this happening to me? So she went to inquire of the Lord. Maybe she went directly, or maybe she went to a prophet of the Lord. But it says she went to inquire of the Lord, and the Lord said to her, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other. The older shall serve the younger. I believe that Isaac knew about this prophecy. Isaac might have even been there when that prophecy was given. The older shall serve the younger. But you see, the problem in this family is favoritism. Because what you have is Isaac favored Esau and Rebekah favored Jacob. And Isaac wanted Esau to receive the blessing, even though the Lord had said, the older shall serve the younger. You see, Isaac put his will before God's will. He knew the prophecy. He knew the older shall serve the younger. And he said, but I still want my firstborn son Esau to receive the blessing. And so Isaac had wrongdoing as well. He may have even known that earlier Esau had sold his birthright to Jacob for a pot of stew. We'll look at that story in a minute. It's likely that he knew about that as well. And one interesting thing about this story is it's all done privately. And you read of the other blessing ceremonies in the Old Testament. And what you'll see is the father will bring all the sons together. The father will bring all the family together. And it is a public, ceremonial blessing. Not in this story. It's all hush, hush. Privately, he brings in Jacob. Doesn't tell Rebekah what he's about to do. Doesn't tell Jacob what he's about to do. So let me tell you, Isaac may look like the innocent victim. He's not. He's trying to do this behind the scenes. He went ahead and lived some 20 to 40, 50 years after this blessing. And he's acting like he's about to die. He just wanted to make sure that Esau got the blessing and not Jacob. And he was willing to bless Esau even though he was a worldly man. This was to be one of the ancestors of the Messiah. He was delineating the lineage of the Messiah, and yet Esau was a godless man. And yet Isaac was still willing to pronounce on him this patriarchal blessing. Look at the worldliness of Esau. Let me first of all remind you about how he was favored by Isaac. In Genesis 25, verses 27 and 28, it says, when the boys grew up, Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field, while Jacob was a quiet man. It actually has the idea of being maybe content or maybe civilized, but he was a quiet man, dwelling in tents. Isaac loved Esau because he ate of his game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. It seems like Isaac was kind of ruled by his stomach, and yet he loved Esau because of the game, and Rebekah loved Jacob. Well, look at chapter 26, verses 34 and 35. It says, at the age of 40, and by the way, this is before Isaac's attempt to bless Esau. At the age of 40, Esau married 2 Hittite wives, Judith, the daughter of Beri, and Basemath, the daughter of Elon. But Esau's wives made life miserable for Isaac and Rebekah. And Esau said, I'm not going to marry among God's people. I'm going to go out and marry not just one Hittite wife. I'm going to marry 2 Hittite wives. I'm going to practice polygamy. And later we learn he even married an Ishmaelite wife. He's a godless man. He's a worldly man. And yet Isaac, because of his love of food, because of his love of game, because of his favoritism for his firstborn son, Esau, he's willing to pronounce his patriarchal blessing upon him. Listen, you might have read this story before and feel like Isaac is the innocent victim. He was not. He was not. You see, God's grace is amazing. God's people are not. Isaac was not an amazing person morally, but God's grace is amazing. Well, what about when you think about not only Isaac's wrongdoing, but what about Esau's wrongdoing? You know, he had already sold the birthright. This was before this blessing ceremony. He had already sold the birthright. Again, the blessing and the birthright, how do they go together? In some ways they overlap. But the birthright is, as the firstborn son, you would get a double share of the inheritance. And when the father died, you became the patriarch of the family. You became the leader of the entire family. That's the birthright. The blessing, which was often connected with the birthright, was that over you would be pronounced the favor of God, the prosperity of God, and also through your seed, through your line, it would be delineated, would come the promised Messiah. Now, Jacob had already sold his birthright. And by selling his birthright, he had no guarantee and no reason to expect that he would receive the blessing. Let me read that story to you. It's a very interesting story as well. Genesis chapter 25, verses 29 through 34. Now, you see both of these brothers at fault. I know Esau's the one condemned, but I want to tell you Jacob is at fault as well. Once when Jacob was cooking stew, Esau came in from the field and he was exhausted. And Esau said to Jacob, let me eat some of that red stew, for I am exhausted. Therefore his name was called Edom. And by the way, from Esau came the Edomites. And Edom meant red. It says, Jacob said, sell me your birthright now. Now, come on, Jacob. Your brother's been out in the field and he's hungry, and you're not even going to give him a bowl of soup. I mean, where's your heart, man? Jacob was cold and calculating. And it says here, he says to Esau, you want a bowl of soup? There's a price tag. It's not $1.50. It's sell me your birthright now. Esau said, man, I'm about to die. Of what use is a birthright to me? I think Esau's being a little bit melodramatic here. Jacob said, swear to me now. So he swore to him and sold his birthright to Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau bread and lentil stew, and he ate and drank and rose and went his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright. He sold his birthright for a bowl of soup. He sold what was a privileged status in that society. That you would receive a double share of the inheritance, that you would become a patriarch and leader in your family. He despised his birthright and he sold it for a bowl of soup. Look at what Hebrews says about this. Hebrews chapter 12, verses 16 and 17. It says, see that no one is sexually immoral or godless like Esau, who for a single meal sold his inheritance rights as the oldest son. Afterward, as you know, when he wanted to inherit this blessing, he was rejected. Even though he sought the blessing with tears, he could not change what had been done. You see, Esau's wrongdoing was he had already sold the birthright. And by giving up the birthright, he was also giving up the blessing. And yet, when his father came to him and said, Esau, I don't know when I'm going to die, And I want you to go out and hunt and get a deer and bring it back and prepare it. And I'm going to bless you. Esau should have said, Dad, I'm sorry, but I've already sold my birthright. I've already relinquished my birthright, and I have no right to receive this blessing. If you want to bless someone, you need to bless Jacob, because we've already had a deal, and I have given him the birthright. That's not what Esau did. Esau tried to separate the blessing from the birthright and said, oh, he swindled me out of my birthright. I'm still going to get the blessing. See, all this was done privately. Isaac, Esau, without Rebekah knowing, she overheard is the only reason she knew about it. And then she told Jacob they were going to have this private ceremony. It's almost like he's writing his will privately and everybody thinks they're going to get something. But when the attorney reads the will, you realize you've been axed out of the will. And so Esau was a godless man, marrying Hittite wives, not following the Lord, willing to sell his birthright for a pot of stew, and yet he was expecting the blessing of God. You see, the problem with Esau, he wanted to be blessed, but not transformed. That's the problem with Esau. He wanted to be blessed, but he didn't want to be changed. He didn't want to be transformed. He wanted to stay that worldly man. He wanted to stay that godless man. He wanted to keep marrying the Hittite wives and the Ishmaelite wives, and he wanted to keep living for himself and living for the things of this world. He wanted the blessing of God, but he didn't want a personal relationship with God. You know anybody like that? Are you like that? Man, I want to go to heaven when I die. I want to be blessed in this life by God, but I don't want a personal relationship with God. I don't want to be transformed by God. I don't want to encounter the living God. You say what you want about Jacob. Let me tell you, Jacob was no perfect man either. But when you trace his life, he encounters God, and he is ultimately transformed by God, and his name goes from Jacob to Israel because of the encounter that he has with God. And yet Esau just remains a flat character. He just remains that godless, profane, worldly man. He wanted to be blessed, but he didn't want to be transformed. That's Esau's wrongdoing. You see, God's grace is amazing, but God's people are not. Well, what about Rebekah's wrongdoing? Well, her wrongdoing was primarily she attempted to fulfill God's plan her way. That's what she did. She wanted to fulfill God's plan her way. Now, she had the prophecy given to her. The older shall serve the younger. She knew that Jacob would be the one blessed by God. She knew that Jacob would be the one through whom the Messiah would come. And maybe that's why she favored Jacob, but she shouldn't have taken it that far. You should never favor one child over another. That happens at times. The father favors one child, the mother favors another child. You know what it does? It causes conflict between those two children. And you need to love all of your children equally because they're all made by God and they all should be loved by you as they are loved by God. And yet Rebekah, she knew the prophecy, the older shall serve the younger. And she overheard that Isaac was about to bless Esau. So she concocts this plan to deceive Isaac. She means well. She's heard the prophecy. She knows that Jacob is the one to receive the patriarchal blessing, and she's afraid that all of this is going to fall apart. Where's her faith in God? Where's this faith that says God's already said it? It doesn't matter what Isaac is about to do. It doesn't matter what Esau's about to do. God has already said it. It's going to come to pass. No. She had to help God's plan along. She had to prop up the plan of God. That was her fault. She tried to fulfill God's plan her way. Why didn't she go in and talk to Isaac and say, Isaac, don't you remember the prophecy? Isaac, don't you remember the older shall serve the younger? Didn't you know that Esau sold his birthright to Jacob? Isaac, this is not the right thing to do. Or what about going to the Lord in prayer and saying, Lord, intervene and interfere. Don't let Esau find any game out there today. You know, that happens sometimes. You go hunting and you don't get anything. And God could have interfered and overturned. And yet she had this plan of deceit, causing her own son to lie to her husband. And in this story, if you read back through it, she never refers to Esau as my son, but as your brother. Esau was not the one she loved. She loved Jacob, and she favored Jacob over Esau. You see, she too was guilty of favoritism. But I want you to know there's a price to be paid. There's a price to be paid when you try to fulfill God's will your way. Yeah, it did work out. Let me tell you, God's grace is amazing. And through the deceit and through the lying, God still worked. And Isaac said, I have blessed him, and he shall be blessed. There's no changing that. God still worked. But oh, Rebekah paid a big price. You see, after this happened, Esau said, I'm going to murder Jacob. You heard about Cain and Abel last week. Well, there was about to be another brotherly murder. And Rebekah got wind of that. You kind of get the idea she got wind of everything that happened in the house. And she said to Jacob, I don't want to lose you, Jacob. I'm going to send you away. I'm going to talk to your dad. We're going to send you away back to my hometown and back to my people, back to my brother Laban. And you're going to get a wife and you're going to come back. And I'm going to see you again. But she didn't see him again. Because he wasn't gone a year or 2 years or 3 years. He was gone for decades. And when he came back, Rebekah had already died. You see, this son that she loved, this son that she favored, this son that she thought she couldn't live without, in concocting this plan, yes, she got the blessing for him, but she never saw him again. There's a price to be paid when you try to fulfill God's plan your way. God's grace is amazing. God's people are not. Well, let me just also talk about Jacob's wrongdoing. I mean, it's pretty self-evident, isn't it? He deceived his father. Bold-faced lies. I am Esau, your firstborn son. Even brought God into the equation. How did you kill the game so quickly? Well, your God gave me success. I've been blessed by God today, Father. That's how I was able to get this game so quickly. You see, the name Jacob means one who grasps the heel or deceiver or cheater. He was a deceiver. He was a smooth man. He admitted that himself. He was a deceitful man. And he deceived his father, lied straight to his dad, and said, I'm Esau. Even covered himself up. You know, when you think about Isaac also, he was a man of his senses. It's really sad when you think about Isaac. You know, when you think about the five senses that we have, when you think about the physical senses, you have sight, you have touch, you have smell, you have taste, and you have hearing. Well, his sight was gone. But in that story, you see, he touches Jacob. And that's when he felt either the hairy garments or the goat skins that were on his hands and on his neck. He smells the garments and even tastes of the food that Rebekah prepared that she knew that he would like. But the sense that he didn't trust was right here, the hearing. The voice is Jacob's. The voice is Jacob's. He knew that. And as you read through the Old Testament, this is the sense that God honors the most, hearing. What doesn't it say this over and over again? Hear ye the word of the Lord. Hear, hear, hear. He was not listening to God. He was not hearing. It was all about touching and tasting and feeling and seeing. Listen, God has given us these 5 senses, and we should not, say, well, I'm not going to be a man with the senses. Well, we have the senses. But let me tell you, there's something greater than the 5 senses, and that's that spiritual sensitivity that God gives you that's greater than what you see, touch, taste, smell, or hear, and that is God in your life and having a personal relationship with God. But when you think about Jacob, he deceived him. He Jacobed his dad. He Jacobed his brother. But there's a price to be paid in his story as well. Because he was this deceiver and this cheater, and he cheated Esau and he cheated Isaac. And then guess who walks into his life, or who he walks into his life? Another cheater named Laban. What goes around comes around. And eventually he met the Lord. It says he wrestled with an angel of the Lord. I can't even go into that story today. And for the rest of his life, he walked with a limp. He had been humbled by God. You see, unlike Esau, he was transformed. God's grace is amazing. God's people are not. Well, let me just bring this to a conclusion. Let me just end by talking about salvation. I think this story reminds us that the blessing of salvation is by grace alone. Grace alone. God's grace is amazing. God's people are not. Salvation is not by works. Salvation is not because you're a good person. Salvation is not by church attendance. Salvation is by the grace of God alone. Look at Romans 9, 10 through 13. And not only so, but also when Rebekah had conceived children by one man, our forefather Isaac, though they were not yet born and had done nothing either good or bad, in order that God's purpose of election might continue, not because of works, but because of him who calls. She was told, the older will serve the younger. As it is written, this is from the book of Malachi, Jacob I loved, but Esau I hated. And that's actually God speaking there. And so Paul is saying, hey, before they were ever born, before they did anything good or bad, so that God's purpose of election might stand or continue, Jacob was chosen, not Esau. Now, does this mean that God really hated Esau? Well, I think God hated his ways. I think God hated his ungodly behavior. But when you read that where it says, Jacob I have loved, Esau I have hated, what it means is, Jacob I have chosen, Esau I have not chosen. I don't think it means that God hated Esau as a person, but God chose Jacob. Why? God chose Jacob that through his lineage, that through his descendants would come the Messiah. He didn't choose Esau, he chose Jacob. He had to choose one or the other, and he chose Jacob. The older will serve the younger. They had not done good or bad. They hadn't done anything to deserve it. Why? So that you would see the grace of God. I don't think it means that he literally hated Esau as a person. He made Esau in the image of God. I believe God loved him too. Hated his ways. Hated his behavior. So what does this say about salvation? Well, let me put it this way. If you're a Jacob, God gets all the glory. If you're in Esau, you have no one to blame but yourself. You see, don't just stay in Romans 9. There's a chapter that follows Romans 9. It's called Romans 10. And in Romans 10, verse 13, it says, "For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved." And let me tell you, everyone means everyone. If you're a Jacob, God gets all the glory. It's the grace of God. There's no patting yourself on the back. God saved me because I'm a good person. God saved me because I'm special. No, it's the grace of God. If you're an Esau, though, and you're not saved, you have no one to blame but yourself. Everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. Would you like to call on the name of the Lord today? The name of Jesus Christ. He came. You go back to Genesis 3 and you have this promise that the seed of woman would defeat the serpent. And you trace that out through Abraham, through Isaac, through Jacob, through Judah, all the way down through David until eventually there's Jesus. Do you believe in Jesus, that He's the Messiah, that He is Lord of lords and King of kings? Have you called on His name to be forgiven of your sins? Let me tell you, God's grace is amazing. God's people are not. Your family's not perfect. My family's not perfect. But God's grace can make the difference. And God's grace can transform your family and make it what it ought to be.
Thank you for joining us today for Towne Church Online. We pray you've been blessed, encouraged, and even challenged by today's message. If you would like to respond in any way, maybe you'd like to give your heart to Jesus, maybe you have a prayer request you'd like to share, or you'd like to just check in and let us know how you're doing, you can go to our website at towne.church/connect and fill out our online Connect card there. Also, if you'd like to give to Towne Church to support the continuing ministry here in our area and beyond, go to our website at towne.church/invest and you can give of your tithes and offerings there. Make sure to like, subscribe, or to follow so you can get these messages each time they come on. You can find the links there in the description of this video. Until we're able to see each other again, we pray you be blessed.